It's a partial number, and the way the press reported it, it is like the only number. It's just a number of murders. And this is where my notes are lacking. Alejandro would know right off the top of his head, but it's about 12,400, huh?
12,900.
900, which is an 11% increase over the rate of murder the year before in the same period of time. Horrible, tragic, horrific, many times very gruesome. Nothing good about it, except that the rate of increase is less than it's been in the past. So if there was one thing one could be hopeful about in that tragedy, it is that the rate of growth in murder from organized crime seems to be decreasing. And certainly there's a little more better news if you look at some of the cities that have been hardest hit in the past. Most notably, Ciudad Juarez, that at one point was the most murderous city in the world, had a murder rate higher than all of Afghanistan, saw approximately, roughly 40% decrease in its murder rate. So that's certainly something to celebrate. Unfortunately, other parts that had lower rates saw a steep increase. But it's a important data point for those of us who are trying to understand really what's going on in terms of public security in Mexico. The second one that probably was not observed or noted by much of anyone other than the geeks like myself that look at this is a report that came out yesterday by well-known criminologist Iván Cepeda. Guillermo Cepeda. Iván Cepeda is another person who is doing a study of impunity. And we could have a long discussion about what impunity is and what it means. It's a difficult term to wrap your head about. Sometimes in the U.S. we talk about in terms of clearance rates, at what rate are cases, and in this case homicide rates, cleared, go through the justice system. And Guillermo's conclusion is that in intentional homicide, not manslaughter, unintentional, but in intentional homicides, the impunity rate, the clearance rate, is about 80%. And that in some particular cities, again, those hardest hit by violence, including Ciudad Juarez and Acapulco and Culiacan, that rate is even higher at 94% or above. Gives you an impression, an idea of a weak, maybe overwhelmed justice system and law enforcement system in Mexico. We're incredibly fortunate this afternoon now to have two real leaders and thinkers on all of these issues. First of all, we'll hear from Alejandro Ope, who is at present working with two civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, on a project called Menos Crimen, what?
Castigo.
Less punishment, less crime, less punishment, sorry. And he has also, in this process of being at IMCO and Mexico Evalua, also become a leading blogger on one of the most important blog spots in the country, Animal Politico. He has his own blog called Plata o Plomo. And if you read Spanish and are interested in these topics, I highly recommend his blog, because he does the kind of thing you'll see him do now in his presentation, really look at the numbers and behind the numbers and try to help us think what the numbers tell us. He has a lot of experience in that, because he served for several years at Mexico's civilian intelligence agency, CISEN, where he was a senior analyst. So we're thrilled to have him here. He has a PowerPoint presentation, which I think we have up and running now. We'll get to that in a minute. Let me just introduce briefly our second speaker, Ernesto Canales, a real long-term advocate for reform of the justice system, the criminal justice system in Mexico. He is founder and president of the board of Renace, one of the leading organizations who promoted the notion of judicial reform and a push towards oral trials, public trials, and the kinds of reforms that are beginning to take shape now in Mexico. And we're delighted to have him here to talk about the status of justice in Mexico and justice reform. A very complex and nuanced story, but he has a wealth of information to share with us on that point. So we'll start with Alejandro, who will look at the bigger picture, the numbers, what those tell us, and then we'll go to Ernesto and talk about the justice system.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you to the Wilson Center for setting up this event. Thank you for SIDAC for inviting me. I'm going to be deliberately provocative in this, beginning with the title, because I'm of the idea that long-term security will most likely improve significantly in Mexico. The only question is when and how that will come about. And maybe, just maybe, we might be at the beginning of the end of of a very, very serious security crisis that we have experienced over the past few years. Let me just try to give you some sense of how big the crisis has been. And to give you a sense of how unexpected this whole thing was. From 1990, I mean, this is a structural issue. The Mexican justice system, it has many, many, many deep flaws. It is loaded with corruption, it's loaded with impunity, but yet, and this is an important issue, yet from 1990 through 2007, the murder rate continuously declined. It declined for almost a generation. By 2007, it was around 8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. To give you a sense, at that point in Brazil was 24. Or in Colombia, if after a decade of Plan Colombia, they are at 33. So Mexico was actually in 2007 one of the most peaceful countries in Latin America. And then all hell broke loose in 2008. And actually we can pinpoint the month. It was May. In May 2008, the murder rate started to go, the number of homicides started to go horrifically, to increase at a horrific rate. By 2010, the number of homicides had tripled, and so had the murder rate. By 2010, the Mexico's homicide rate was exactly the same as Brazil's, which was not the case before. It's not only homicides, this is an important issue, and a whole gamut of violent crime has also increased at the same time as homicides. If you look at this graph, what this shows is the number of kidnapping reports versus the number of reported homicides on a monthly basis. And pretty much it means that homicides and kidnappings were growing at the same pace, pretty much in the same places. It's the same story for extortion, it's the same story for carjackings, it's the same story for other forms for violent theft, for other forms of violent crime. It went up. So it kind of means that there's a single mechanism that is driving all these factors. And also to give you a sense of how unprecedented this has been, what I just tried to compare this to, say, the most common comparison is Colombia in the 1980s. But actually, you normalize the series. Of Colombia in the 80s and Mexico the past 3 years. Mexico has the number of homicides in Mexico has grown twice as fast as they did in Colombia in the 80s during the war against Pablo Escobar. It took Mexico 3 years what in Colombia took 7. So I mean, this has been quite amazing. So, and it is. There is a structural story. There's a structural story, and I'm sure Mr. Canales will talk more about this. But there's also a more short-term story, which has to do partially with government policy, but also partially with structural changes in drug markets. I'm going to talk more about the spike in the price of cocaine, but there are other changes that might have driven this. What is also interesting is that basically violence started feeding on itself. How so? This is a mechanism that Mark Lehman, who's a good friend of the Wells Center and has been here several times as a noted criminologist, calls enforcement swamping. What is enforcement swamping? Enforcement swamping is that an increase to the extent that the capabilities of a state are more or less fixed in the short term. Any increase, any rapid increase in the short term will tend to overwhelm those capabilities. And since those capabilities are overwhelmed, then suddenly the probability that any single act of violence will be punished goes down. And since there's less probability, and then there will be more, and then it starts feeding on itself. So what we had is 30 months, basically 30 months of very, very, very rapid growth in the number of violent incidents. From early 2008 to May of 2010, the number of intentional homicides, and I'm using the broad definition of intentional homicides, because I don't want to get into this discussion whether it was caused or not by organized crime. But it went from 29 on a daily average, from 29 each day to 60 within 30 months. And pretty much everyone thought that this would continue, given the mechanisms and the drivers of this, that this would continue. And then suddenly, a very strange thing happened, which is the fact that from June 2010 onwards, the violence plateaued. And it plateaued at a very, very high level, at around 60 homicides per day on a national basis, but it has remained at that level pretty much plus minus 10% over the past 18 months. And again, this is not a story that is well known either in Mexico or in the U.S., but I think it's an important story, and it's something that we don't quite understand what happened, because whatever caused the rapid growth and earlier phases of this administration should have been there also in the latter phases. So what's going on? And again, before getting into explanation, I mean, in some cities, in some localities, in some states, you're starting to see a decline, and a relatively rapid decline. Eric already mentioned Ciudad Juárez, but I want to show you the graphs so you can see how significant this has been. I mean, on average, in 2010, there were 263 intentional homicides every month in Ciudad Juárez. To give you a sense, that's the number of homicides there's every year in Sweden in a year. Ciudad Juárez had it every month. So this was 263. This more or less meant a homicide rate of around 300, which was about 15 times the national rate. And then, beginning probably late 2010, but more significantly in 2011, the violence started to drop. And it has dropped pretty much by half over the past year. It is still at a very high level, around 100 per month. But it is now just, it used to be catastrophic, now it's just really bad. but improving. Why? I mean, this is something that we need to explain. Tijuana is a different story. It declined earlier, and it has remained at a relatively low levels over the past 2 or 3 years, and it's a more controversial story in some ways. But in other, you also have this. For instance, you have a similar decline in other northwestern cities. You have a similar decline in Culiacan. Well, not as pronounced, but you also have a decline in Culiacan. You have a decline in places like Chihuahua. You have in Sonora. In most of western Mexico, this has been more or less the pattern. So, what is going on? And this is because we don't have a full explanation for this, but let me try to pinpoint some of the things that have been happening. One is that maybe, just maybe, the capabilities of the state might be starting to catch on to the size of the problem, maybe. The budget, the federal budget for the security expenditures has doubled over the past 5 years. Well, almost double. It has increased by 74%. For SSP, for the Public Safety Ministry, it has more than doubled. The number of federal forces have also increased significantly. The size of federal police has quadrupled over the past 4 years. So this might be part of the larger story. Secondly, it might be the case that there are some changes in tactics on the ground. This very distinguished gentlemen are all upper middle level members of other cartels that have been arrested over the past year, over the past 6 months or so. The first one is a guy known as El Mamito. He was the number 3 operative in Zetas. I mean, the other guy is Noé Salgueiro, or AKA El Flaco. This guy is this is the man, the Chapo Guzman sent to Ciudad Juárez to fight the war in Ciudad Juárez. And third one was pretty much the military head of the Juárez cartel, AKA El Diego. And these are only examples, but there have been over the past year an interesting development of the past years that no high-level capos have been detained since December 2010. But a whole bunch of upper middle level operatives have been detained, and these guys might be the key transmission rod between the leadership and whatever is happening on the ground. So this might have disrupted the command and control structures of the cartels, maybe. And finally, drug market, the international drug markets might be starting to move in Mexico's favor. I mean, this is a graph. Or what we did here is we graphed the number of homicides per quarter against the price of cocaine in the U.S. as reported by the DEA. And you see a tremendous spike in the price of cocaine beginning in mid-2007 and reaching a high point in late 2008. And homicide pretty much move in the same direction. Unfortunately, we don't have the numbers leading up to 2011, but there are other information that we do have, which is the number of consumers in the U.S. and how much they might be consuming cocaine. We did a demand-side estimate using the numbers from National Survey on Drug Use and Health in the U.S. And what we think that there has been a tremendous destruction of demand by the price produced by this price spike over the past 4 or 5 years. The number of consumers, or past month consumers in the U.S. has declined by about 25% since 2006. This might translate into a decline of about 40 tons. 40 tons, to give you a sense, is about $1 billion in lost income. This, I mean, the finances, the economics of the drug trade might be deteriorating at this point. And this is not being replaced by anything else, at least on the drug side. Methamphetamine had its peak in 2005. Heroin has remained pretty much stable the past decade. And marijuana has increased, but the problem with marijuana is, one, it's very cheap, and two, there's a lot of competition. So it's not a very good sector for the drug cartels. Actually, the growth industry in terms of the illegal drug market in the U.S. is prescription drugs, and that's an area where the Mexican cartels have little or no impingement. So looking forward, what could happen? This might be, I mean, what we're seeing might be just a brief pause in a continually upward trend. But I mean, the fact that this has lasted already by about 18 months leads me to think this is unlikely. More likely is that we might be stabilizing, and this might be the situation in Mexico for a relatively long period of time. We might be stabilizing at very, very high levels. Finally, we might start to see some decline going forward, the rate of which will depend on policy choices. What type of policy choices, and how could we see an accelerated decline going forward? One is whether there will be some specific policy to create disincentives to violence. That means some type of focused deterrence strategy, as described by Mark Lehman and others, meaning sending a direct, consistent, and repeated warnings to drug cartels that there is a line in the sand, and if they cross that line, there will be significant repercussions. Secondly, there needs to be a strategy to reduce some of the opportunities for violent crime. That means some situational prevention measures, which might be, I mean, some of which have been tried, and there is already some evidence that some of these measures might have workings. For instance, Ciudad Juárez. There was an area called PRONAF in Ciudad Juárez where they installed security filters, they put traffic calming measures, they closed some streets, and that might have led to a decrease in homicides, but also extortion and even kidnapping. Also is whether they will continue hitting this mid-level structures going forward, and whether that would also reduce the capabilities of the criminal structures to reproduce themselves. But over the medium term, and this is entering, I mean, whether or not this was produced by structural factors, it is a fact that the Mexican law enforcement system is rotten to its core. And in many ways, the police forces are not functional. The justice system is unfair and inefficient. The prisons are a disaster zone. So much needs to be done. But everyone knows this. Everyone knows what's the agenda for change. The problem is political. It is that right now there are political incentives for everyone to pass the ball to the other side, i.e., particularly between the federal government and state governments. No one wants to take responsibility for whatever is their piece of the puzzle. So part of the agenda going forward needs to be to align political incentives in favor of reform. That might imply the creative use of budget, of the federal budget as lever, more creative than it has been the case recently. That might mean having some target transfers for states that, for instance, reach some relevant flagpoles in terms of the criminal reform of the criminal justice system. It might mean some form of transfers to accelerate implementation of prison reform. And part of the problem has been that some of the institutional design that has been put on the table is way too complex and leads to that leads to veto points in many cases. So we might try to with some simpler rules. For instance, there has been proposed that we might have some constitutional reform to force small municipalities to subcontract their police force to either the state or the federal government. Right now there's a bill in Congress along this line that has not moved, basically because it would not disappear all the municipal forces, but it would place them all under the authority of the governor of the state, which in many states means that means that it's dead on arrival, because no mayor of any large municipality will ever agree to have to relinquish control of their police forces. So what might be useful is to implement a strategy or a rule such as they have, say, in Spain or in Canada, that municipalities below a certain threshold population or fiscal resources have to subcontract their services, their police services. Might be one possibility. The other large agenda is how do we facilitate accountability and transparency in the system. And we need to far more develop independent oversight mechanisms over some of the institutions. And we also need more external evaluation of police or of security policies and programs. Right now, security policy in Mexico is an evidence-free area. We really don't know what works and what doesn't in many ways. Compared to, say, the process in terms of social policy and other areas, what we see is far more led by faith and belief than by science and method. We might have, there have been some proposed to create an independent police complaints commission on the British model. There has been some proposals to create mandatory impact evaluation rules for all federally funded security programs, and to do some type of external public audit of crime statistics. I mean, this is an important issue because, I mean, some states, some authorities have been, let's put it this gently, reluctant to update some of their numbers. For instance, in the state of Veracruz has reported 0 kidnappings, 0 for the past 24 months. And that is, and of course you go to Veracruz, you will find out rather quickly that that is probably not accurate. I mean, to try to get to try to distinguish fact from fiction is an important issue going forward. But I mean, that's for the future. But looking way forward, I'm guessing. Well, I'm not guessing. I would be willing to bet that over next 10 to 15 years, the security environment in Mexico will radically improve, and it will radically improve for at least 3 reasons, some of which are connected to what we discussed this morning. One is that drug trafficking, large-scale drug trafficking, will in all likelihood decline in Mexico. One is because at some point over the next decade, the U.S. will probably legalize marijuana. That takes about 30% of the drug cartel's income, export income. Secondly, is that U.S. The decline in consumption of cocaine in the U.S. is probably a long-term trend. Has been going on for 10, 15 years. It will probably continue over the next decade. And this is more speculative, but still, just put it on the table. We might see a gradual reopening of the Caribbean route. Why? Because of the fact that the Castro brothers are not immortal. They will die. at some point over the next decade. That must
Looks like there's some skepticism on
there's-
that.
they might have some pact with the devil, whatever. But I mean, it's likely that they could die. If they die, what happens? And it happens that there might be a disorderly transition in Cuba, and that creates, I think, three dynamics. One is that trade with the U.S. will increase quite rapidly. So will flows of people, tourists going back and forth. And secondly, you will have a lot of unemployed spies and a lot of unemployed intelligence officers that might be looking for other opportunities in the labor market. That might but there is a broader issue, which is that in many ways the cost of labor and land in Mexico will probably become very expensive for large-scale drug trafficking over next 10 to 15 years. This is an area where I think Mexico will suffer a beneficial loss of competitiveness. But we'll see. But I mean, in other types of illicit traffic will also decline. Think of human trafficking. I mean, migration flows are way down, and will continue to be way down over the next 2 decades. That will also kind of disappear as a source of money. But then, thinking more internally, there are a number of technological developments that could also shift the way crime and punishment it takes place. One is the fact that cash will likely decline as a means of payment over the next 10 to 20 years. So that eliminates some of the forms of the most egregious forms of violent crime. Secondly, there will be probably a massification of GPS geolocalization devices, the so-called Internet of Things, that most things will be interconnected in some way or another. So you could have remote surveillance of pretty much everything. And third is that you will have decentralized surveillance, and social network would likely play a role that is far more important than what we see right now. For instance, in Monterrey, they're already using Twitter in very creative ways to fight crime. And that will also likely increase over the next decade. And finally, connecting with the whole clase mediero issue is that even if economic growth over the next 1 to 2 decades is slow in Mexico, it is the case that by, say, 2025, you will have a much larger public purse, therefore much bigger resources to spend on security. 2, you will likely have increased legal economic opportunities, which means that the risk-adjusted returns to crime will be lower. It is if you want, say, mules in Mexico, say drug mules or whatever, will be much more expensive in 10, 15 years. Finally, I mean, if there is indeed this evolution towards a middle-class society, there will be far more pressure on the political system to provide high-quality public services. And given the notoriety and the centrality of crime, of law enforcement, there will likely be a political environment that leads to improved services. So I'm a pessimist of reason and optimist of will. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, Alejandro. Let's turn now to Don Ernesto. I neglected to say one thing about Ernesto Canales, and that is that in addition to founding Renace, he was also instrumental in building what was known as the network for or in favor of oral trials in Mexico, was very instrumental in advocacy for justice reform in the country. So, thank you. and a very well known documentary now, Presumed Guilty, Presunto Culpable. So, anyway.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to be here present with this audience. I'm very pleased to be here with you. My topic here is more related to the reform, the criminal system reform that is undergoing in Mexico at this time. It is related, as it has been mentioned here several times, with the war against violence, because to have a weak criminal system leads to not being able to fight this war with possibilities to be won. It is not an exaggeration to say that a national movement to transform the Mexican legal system is being carried out in the country. It is loud and clear in the criminal legal system, and from there it has spread to other areas. Let me explain how all this began. In Monterrey, almost 20 years ago, a group of friends decided to act at the cruelest atrocity our criminal system had created: the treatment of the poor. Those people unjustly subjected to a Mexican criminal process with no means to defend themselves. For these individuals, neither their families, there was not a possible way out. We set up RENACE, a non-profit organization to defend such cases. It wasn't difficult to find ones that were so emblematic to call public attention, like a 74-year-old man with a leg prosthesis sentenced for homicide, supposedly for participating in a gang fight of young men he had not known before. The judge never met or saw the accused, nor considered his physical condition, the age difference, the lack of prior contacts with the perpetrators. A young mother in jail with a sentence for 7 years, accused of stealing diapers for her baby, lost her freedom and her son. An 18-year-old man sentenced to 12 years in prison for stealing 2 kilos of beef barbecue in a night of many drinks. The list could go on. After reviewing and documenting more than 20,000 cases, it became obvious to us and to the academicians supporting our work that most of the injustices were caused by the applicable laws and regulations. They were geared to render unrestricted powers to the state and therefore to the authorities in charge. Mexico concentrated its political power under the umbrella of one political party for more than 70 years. The laws therein enacted, with a certain degree, were to enable such system in order to retain its quasi-absolute power. A non-challenged power was obtained, among other avenues, through granting vital discretionary power to the executive branch in areas related to criminal prosecution. These discretionary powers were not left only at the service of the elite for political control, but they had to be permitted in the laws to all levels in the criminal processes, to police, district attorneys, and judges. All receive substantial allocation of discretionary powers. The one-party structure served as a self-controlling instrument to guarantee an orderly and timely utilization of such powers. The arrival of democracy in Mexico had the effect that the discretionary areas enthralled in the criminal laws had lost their original purpose. What have happened with these holes, areas where justice has not been served in the last 10 years? In essence, they have been grabbed by the state governments, which maintain most of the elements of the one-party system within the limits of their respective territory, or were left headless at the mercy of the market forces to be taken by the ablest, not necessarily by those seeking justice. I will use some examples of how the laws and regulations perverted the criminal process in Mexico. The evidences presented by the district attorneys at a criminal trial cannot be contradicted or challenged, nor even evaluated by the judges. The accused and the victims have very limited rights in the process. They cannot cross-examine the accusers, neither the witnesses. More than 90% of the condemnatory sentences have been based solely on the confession of the accused, not rendered before a judge. Also, close to another 90% of the cases, the presiding judges were not present when the evidences were introduced in the respective processes. Pre-trial prison is granted automatically for most crimes, making it null the concept of presumed innocence. More than 50% of prisoners are held in jail without having been sentenced by a due process. In the absence of a control umbrella, these rules entice criminal authorities to offer their legal muscle to the best bidder. Money or favor could gain favorable resolutions with all the respectability of being legal. As a consequence, corruption has been institutionalized from the lowest to the highest level of the criminal pyramid. There is a story of a governor calling his state district attorney, asking to liberate a man accused of a homicide. How come, the district attorney said, if all the evidences are against him? Well, the governor responded, you act as always, but in this instance, without you receiving the 50,000 pesos payment. The distortion of our penal system put this vital segment outside the rule of law. But how did we in Renace manage to make a national movement to change the system, departing from an analytical point of view held by few? We widely emailed a 3-page letter to be understood by anyone, stating the 5 cruelest atrocities of the present system and presented solutions based in changing the system from a written to oral trials. Our selling points were transparency, efficiency, better rights to victims and accused, limiting district attorneys' powers for a fairer field, and centering the process on an oral and public hearing, presided by the judge, where all the evidences and arguments needed to be presented. Simultaneously, we worked out the Monterrey community on a one-to-one basis. In 3 years, in 1994, we obtained from the state of Nuevo León the first enactment of a criminal reform, although very limited and timid. It covered only minor crimes. However, from the legitimacy of a state power, it amounted to the first official recognition that the criminal system in the country needed to be changed. The change generated enough interest as to be taken it seriously. Soon, Monterrey expanded its coverage to more crimes and transported the rules to family, house, and commercial leasing and minors. The academic world of the country has been the motor of this change. Thousands of works have been created. Magaloni, Carbonell, Sarre, Rio, Cepeda, Rabasa, Ochoa, Carrasco, Ponce, and many others have contributed with talent and time to this cause. Also, it is only fair to mention that Alejandro Martí, María Elena Morero, and Isabel Wallace, who themselves have been victims of the criminal system, have raised their voice to claim these changes. With this vast army, the federal constitution was amended in 2008, making it mandatory for the country to transform in a period of 8 years the criminal system, adopting the concepts of the oral trials. But history proved once again that it's not linear. A tremendous violence has erupted in Mexico, and President Calderón made its war a priority. Some within the federal authorities have taken the position that the new system hinders the authorities' ability to win over the criminal organizations. Natural resistance to change and lack of qualified personnel have been a factor to overcome in the many areas where the implementation of this reform touches. It has taken more than 3 years to win over such obstacles. Our main argument has been the negative. Not taking action shall mean to maintain the 15% ratio of crimes denounced for lack of trust in the present system. Only a credible and robust system of justice, erected through the transparency and efficiency of an oral system, can convince people to seek justice through criminal authorities. Force without a solid justice system can be at the service of criminal organization. This has been painfully obvious where most of policemen have worked for the lords of evil for not having a structured police in the line of justice. In a credible frame, police will receive better information to pursue criminals and will have an incentive to behave well, since their work will be judged in a public trial. In spite of the constitutional amendment that has not been implemented yet by a new code, a new body of laws, many other actions have been taken that we can say that the Mexican criminal system is in the way of being improved in a very substantial manner. Like because I have limited time, I will end with by saying that many many actions like restructuring police, which is a substantial element in the fight of the war against drugs. It's been already a reality in Mexico. Also, the judiciary has taken many actions to change the manner by which the judges see this criminal process at their desk. So we can, 12 states have already taken the new rules as a way to deal with the problem. And there are other 8 states that are in the process of doing so. So it is an irreversible movement. It would take some time yet, and many tasks need to be performed. But we can say that we can count that Mexico is going to take out an important territory out of corruption. Several organizations have been working out for this, and we strongly believe that once good results are being seen in other areas, also the corruption element can be dealt by enacting good rules. Thank you.
Okay, a great overview, panorama of the situation, both in terms of violence and justice reform. We have time for some questions. We don't have a lot of time, but maybe I can take 3 to start with, and then we'll see where we are with that. Diana, gentleman over here, but go ahead, Diana. Let's wait.
Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. Alejandro Hoppe, how do you reply to the widely held view in this town that Mexico is pushing the problem of drug trafficking southward, and that Mexico will tolerate Central America as being the principal route for drug smuggling, whether it be to Europe or to the US?
I'm Mr. Lloyd from Baltimore. I would like to address my question to Mr. Ernesto Canales. I have 2 simple and short questions. Number 1 is about the geographic distribution of drugs and crimes in Mexico. The question is, do you have a geographical distribution of how many, the rate of crimes? Because you said that there was a spike of crimes in Mexico starting 2007. Yes, as per your presentation. So which part of Mexico are these crimes rampant? Is it in the south, the north, or Baja California, central part, or wherever? And my next question is, with all of these crimes, how much of these are drug-related, or crimes against property, or crimes against persons? Thank you.
So one other question. Oh, look, there's right next to you there, Liz, and we'll get Steve, and then we'll call up.
Thank you. This is Jose Diaz Briceño with Reforma newspaper. In this world of Twitter and Facebook and the internet and everything, I just came up with President Calderon just gave a speech in Mexico City, and he was making the case for the increase in the drug consumption in Mexico because of Mexico growing as a middle-class country. So it's exactly the opposite argument to Alejandro Hoppe's presentation. And I will also ask you about exactly the topic of drug prices, because you mentioned cocaine prices as something separate to law enforcement, and that's exactly the opposite to what people in this town make about cocaine prices, that precisely the spike of the price is caused by at least Mexican law enforcement at the border and, creating less drug available in the U.S.
And Stephen, and then we'll take some answers here.
Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Rule of law has been a theme through all of the presentations today. And I guess implied in that is, in order for Mexico to be competitive going forward economically and in its quest to be viewed as a modern world country, modern economy. But we've talked mainly with respect to rule of law about criminal law. Can you talk, you or any of the previous panelists, talk about whether or not this will extend to commercial law and to ensuring that Mexico doesn't continue to be a place where, as we've talked marginally about, monopolies being able to maintain their position because of their manipulation of the judicial process, because of the amparo after amparo after amparo. Does that affect rule of law and the perception of rule of law, and is there any chance that that will change?
We'll start with you, Alejandro. I think several of them
Okay.
directed to you.
Okay, Central America. Yes, I mean, there might have been policy decisions taken in Mexico that might have driven some portion of the drug trade, or particularly the cocaine trade, from maritime routes or from air routes towards land routes in Central America. One of which being the fact in January 2008, the Mexican government took the decision that all private aircraft flying in from Central or South America had to land for inspection in either Tapachula or Cozumel. That might have been the beginning of a significant increase in air traces going into either Honduras, the Atlantic coast of Honduras, or northern Guatemala, which means that now land routes in Mexico were longer. Mexico cannot push the problem to Central America. Or at least, I mean, it makes no sense strategically, because Central America has no value, well, might have some value, but pretty much has no value except for its access to Mexican routes into the U.S. If the value, they are interconnected. There might be maybe some routes going, say, from Colombia to Honduras and then on to, say, Florida. But I don't think, I'm not sure how significant that is. That's a pretty ineffective answer, but and still. On distribution of crimes, yes, there has been a significant concentration of homicides over the past few years. As of in 2011, the numbers that Eric was talking in the beginning, 5 states concentrated 55% of the homicides. That being Chihuahua, Guerrero, Tamaulipas, Sinaloa, and Nuevo León. Not in that order, by the way. But it has, yes, it is a concentrated phenomenon, but not as concentrated as it used to be, and that's an important issue. Those numbers show that 831 municipalities in Mexico had at least one quote-unquote, drug-related homicide. Those drug-related homicides are a source of controversy because this is not built, they're not calling it drug-related as a result of a judicial investigation that leads you to the causes of that particular crime. It is, there's a methodology whereby if the homicide has certain characteristics, say they have they are tied or behind the back, or they have a shot in the back of the neck, or they are decapitated, or things of that nature, then it might be, or it has a message saying this is because you don't respect the Zetas or whatever. I mean, that is considered a organized, a drug-related homicide. But still, there might be copycats. There was this famous story of this woman in Sinaloa, or this guy that was killed in Sinaloa, and the guy had indeed he had tape, brown tapes all around his face. He had been tied up. He had a message saying, "This is because you don't respect Chapo," or whatever. And the wife did it. Apparently, or so the story goes. So this is more science than art. This is more art than science. And actually, even with homicide numbers, you have 2 different databases that give you a different story. You have the one that comes from the law enforcement, that comes from the Procuradurías, from the Attorney General's offices, and that is driven by allegedly judicial investigations or averiguaciones previas. And then you have another one that is from INEGI that comes from the health authorities, from public health authorities, and from the civil registry there has to be someone documenting that someone died. And the difference can be quite significant. In 2010, the INEGI database registered 25,000 homicides. The SNCP, the law enforcement database, registered a bit less than 21,000. So I mean, and in some states it can be 2-to-1 differences. So it is significant. As of drug consumption, yes, indeed, there will be more drug consumption in Mexico in the next years. But there can be many equilibria in terms of violence at any given given level of drug consumption. Some drug markets are far more violent than others. For instance, crack, cocaine, marijuana retail markets tend not to be violent. Crack cocaine markets, particularly open-air markets, tend to be extremely violent. And also, it depends on what the type of distribution network there exists. A system where you have very, very visible market transactions, illegal market transactions would, ceteris paribus, tend to be more violent than, say, a Domino's Pizza model where you call someone and they bring you the drugs. It all depends. It all depends what type of market organization or industrial organization creates what type of demand, what type of response the state has to that increased drug consumption. But indeed, there tends to be relatively high income elasticity with the illegal drug consumption.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to refer to the last question regarding the rule of law in Mexico. It is difficult to understand from outside, but Mexico has, in some areas, one of the most sophisticated way of laws. That is, the country in areas related to businesses, generally speaking, have laws up to the last generation in communications and in many new areas. It is, I would say, more in this criminal system and where the corruption is more rampant. In other areas, not necessarily. There is always the same level as in the criminal system. And of course, if we are able to get out this chunk of corruption, it will certainly serve as an example to other areas.
I forgot one question to answer question about cocaine prices. The problem with the increase in interdiction causing higher cocaine prices, there is a problem with theory. There has not been more interdiction in Mexico. I mean, the seizures of cocaine in this administration have been pretty much on average, what you have seen over the past 15 years. You had a record year, almost record year in 2007, where they seized 47 tons. But the next 2 or 3 years, 2008, 2009, were a bit below average. It was reversion to mean to around 19 tons. And in 2010, we had the lowest seizure total in a generation since the 80s, 9 tons. And 2011 was probably around that total. Higher prices might be more impacted by a decline in potential production in Colombia than whatever is being done in Mexico. Well, at least that's my very humble opinion about that. Okay.
Is there maybe one more question? I know we're really pushing the limit here on time, but Andrew promises to make his closing remarks very brief. So, and Luis Rubio. Was there one more question in the back there on that side? I'm sorry, I can't see very well from these lights.
Sure.
So,
I'm Raul Rangel, just a worried Mexican. This question is for Mr. Ernesto Canales. What would you say, Mr. Canales, have been the major problems for the oral judge, los juicios orales, for them to have been implemented in Mexico? And what will be your recommendations going forward in order to implement them better?
Well, time is a limit here. No, if I have to choose, I would say that just changing the culture is the most challenged action. It is. It also you can say that taking out power from the state authorities is not an easy task. I would put the third will be to prepare for the new way of doing, and that is improving the level of abilities of the actors of the criminal system. I would say those three areas are the most important. What we're doing now? It's just pushing hard. That's trying to convince more people about the need for the country to take these actions. How the criminal system has, in a way, been surpassed by the developments in the political areas of the country.
And there is a strong impression, I think probably accurate, that the government has invested a great deal in modernizing the police,
Yes.
more or less successfully, depending on how you view it, but they've certainly invested a tremendous amount. I mean, it's gone from 6,000 to 36,000, but the same investment has not been in the justice system. Now, you could argue you don't need dollar for dollar the same kind of investment, but still it
Yes.
seems askew in large part. Does that seem accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. The problem is, why is that? I mean, why?
Why?
Why there has not been assignment of a larger budget to improve the justice system, and well, it's all these type of reasons that I have been trying to explain.
I mean, I guess when you say the cultural changes are the most difficult, it refers to that there's a culture of justice based solely or primarily on apprehension and imprisonment, not a culture of justice as we understand it in this culture, in this country.
Yes.
And a culture, I imagine, among judges.
Yeah.
Well, we can say again regarding the status of the Mexican legal system that this change in the political scene of not having a one-party structure any longer, it has had a great beneficial effect, that the independence of the judiciary in Mexico is very strong.
Right.
We have an impeccable Supreme Court ruling, and that's something that can be built up from up down.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all very, very much. We'll call on Luis Rubio and Andrew Seeley just to wrap up, parting pearls of wisdom.
You guys can stay up here. We'll just stand up here at the podium. So, Luis.
We've tried to present a series of perspectives and views. There's no objective of coherence or of compatibility. The idea is to have a true series of perspectives of how Mexicans see the problems that Mexico's facing. The only area in which there is clear compatibility, in which every single presentation here can be seen as reflected, is that Mexico faces a true challenge of governance, of building its governing capacity, institutional capacity, in whether it's in the political arena, whether it's in the electoral arena, in the security arena. In every one of those areas, that's the big issue. The middle class problems, the middle class quandaries reflect the lack of governance capacity. And that goes through the issues, through the sectors, through the political parties. The question is how will that be tackled, and whether that will be on a timely fashion. Thank you very much.
Well, just to add to what Luis said, I mean, I think there's an underlying, what we heard from our second panel, an underlying sense that Mexicans are deeply interested in these issues. It will be a competitive election. There are lots of alternatives, though many of the proposals may be looking similar. There are different emphases on how you do these things. And yet there are also some structural issues on governance that Maria Amparo pointed to, Leonardo pointed to, the fact that this will be competitive, but also that this will, as Maria Amparo pointed out, we're going to see some real underlying challenges that will make governance hard no matter who wins in the future, and that undermine some of the confidence in the system. We are seeing a development of Mexican societies. We heard from the first panel, an economic development that is still fragile, but is optimistic, that has some positive things where people are stakeholders in the future and think they have a future in a stake in the future being better in Mexico. But of course, this is fragile. We're not talking about a middle class in the same way as in Bethesda in many cases when we talk about Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl. We're talking about a middle class that is beginning to think about its future, that is beginning to have some assets, is beginning to have some stake in things continuing to move forward, but also has some real concerns about where things could go. And so it is fragile, but it's also optimistic. And finally, I mean, the question of the day, there is both movement forward, and I think Alejandro is probably correct, as Eric said as well. We are seeing perhaps a topping off, and we can hope that it is a topping off and not a gentle plateau that then spikes up again. But there probably is a topping off of the worst of the security crisis in Mexico. But as Ernesto was saying, that does not necessarily mean the problem is solved. And indeed, there's a risk that if things become less violent or it plateaus, that people may turn to other tasks without actually completing the task of building rule of law. And that ultimately is a major challenge on which everything else we've talked about depends in Mexico, that really establishing the foundations of rule of law. And with that, I think I want to thank Luis Rubio and SIDAC for putting this together, and want to thank all of the fabulous panelists for coming here today, and all of you.
Andrew, I just thought we should say again that we've videoed this conference. We'll post that, and also post the various PowerPoints. I know I saw people frantically trying to write down statistics, but check back in a week or so, and we should have it all up on the portal.